This is a basic if-else statement written in Java. It looks exactly the same as it does in JavaScript. I just have an if with some kind of Boolean conditional here, and if this is true, it prints x equals y. Else if this is true, it does this statement, and else it does the last statement. And this really is nothing new for you. Notice I have, just like in JavaScript, I have curly brackets defining the beginning and the end of my if, right? So everything that I put inside these curly brackets will happen if this if is true. And I like to line things up, and then else if, curly brackets, and my else curly brackets. And of course, you know that you can have as many else ifs as you like. I could have if some condition, else if this, else if that, and a whole bunch of else ifs and one else at the end. And of course, you also know that you really don't need to have an else condition. This is also totally fine. You know you really don't need an else if. This is also totally legit, and as a matter of fact, you don't even need an else. You can just have an if all by itself. Again, this is nothing new for you. A couple other things about style. Sometimes you'll see the curly bracket on the same line as the if or else if. Also totally fine, but it's nice if you're consistent in your program. Sometimes I write it this way, it saves some space. And there's actually a couple other things too. You actually don't need the curly brackets if you only have a single line of code after your if or else if. So this is also totally fine. No curly brackets necessary, but that's only true because I only have a single line of code after my else or my else if or my if. So this is totally legit. All right, hang in there just for a couple moments. We're going to do a couple of quick examples. This is the first example. And maybe even pause the video on this one. I want you to take a look at this if, else if, else if, else if, else statement and think about whether or not it works correctly. In other words, will it assign the correct grade based on whatever I pass in? Obviously, you know, an A is above a 90 and a B is above an 80 and so forth. So take a look at it, maybe even pause the video for a moment and think about whether you think this is going to work correctly. All right, you got it? I'm going to run it now. So I'm passing it a grade of a 90. And if I run this, it should say you got an A, and it seems to work properly. Maybe I'll put in a 75, which I hope should be, what is a 75? Well, that should be a C. It's greater than 70. You know, I'll compile it, and let's see if this works. I can run this as well, and they get a C. So this seems to work. Now, if I enter like a 5, I guess that should be an F. Now, this, of course, is assuming that I'm entering a valid number. If I put something that's not a number here, it won't work, obviously. All right, let's look at a couple more examples. Here's a second example of an if statement with the same, very similar. You know, I'm passing in a grade, and I wanted to say you got an A if it's above 90, you got a B if it's above 80. So take a look at this one, pause the video if you need to, and think about whether or not you think this one works correctly. Have you got it? Does it work right? Well, let's try it on a couple of grades. So let's see if they got a 90. Wait a minute. It says they got a D. Why didn't this one work correctly? Well, I'm sure you figured it out. It's because I have a bunch of if statements here. So in fact, it ran this first if. Yeah, their grade is above 90, but then it kept going. Since this is not an else if, it also looked at this statement. Yeah, their grade of 90 was above 80, so then it assigned string, you got a B, and so forth. It kept going, and finally 90 is above a 65, so it assigned string, str, you got a D, and then it returned you got a D. Well, that's not awesome. So if I made these else ifs, again, that would work correctly. All right, let's look at a third example. All right, I hope you're looking at this third example here. Now, I wrote these on one line, so it looks a little compressed, but I think it's still quite readable. So what do you think? So just so you realize I have multiple return statements here, that in itself is legal. But tell me whether you're, not tell me, but think about whether or not you think this one works properly. Pause the video if you need to. Have you got it? Well, let's run it. Let's try it with 90. So if their grade is a 90, in fact, it works. They got an A. Well, what if I put in, I don't know, an 85, not 850, that should be a B. And let's see if that works. That works. We'll try another. Let's try a 55. So I guess that should probably be an F. And In fact, it is. So why does this one work? I don't have else ifs here, but I do have multiple return statements. So what's happening is as soon as one of these is true, it returns, it jumps out of this method and returns to the main method that called this. So hopefully that works for you. Hopefully you understand what's going on here. This is a totally legitimate, valid way of writing a method with multiple return statements. You're going to do this pretty often, and it's quite useful. All right, we're going to look at one more example, so hang in there with me. This is our last example here. So here's how you can sometimes get yourself into trouble by not using curly brackets. I do like to use curly brackets to really show what's inside my if or what's inside my else, generally speaking. So this is one of those cases where it's hard to tell, does this else go with this if, or does this else go with this if? Sometimes this is referred to as the dangling else problem. The programmer did not use curly brackets, and it's just kind of hard to tell. So if you want to pause the video now for a moment, that'd be a good idea, because I want to know what's going to happen when I run this. What do you think? In other words, does this else go with this if, or does it go with the first if? All right, hopefully you've paused the video and given it some thought, and I'm going to run it. And in fact, nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Well, it said if x is greater than 10, which it's not greater than 10, so you would have expected that it should have gone to this else and said it's less than 10, but it didn't. And the reason is because this else goes with the if that's closest to it if there's no curly brackets. Let me just say that again. This else is really going with this if. If the user wanted this else to go with the first if, they should have put curly brackets in. I assume that this is probably, oh my God, now I've made a big mess here. I'm assuming that they probably, or let's assume that the programmer wanted something like, I don't know, I'm having so much typing trouble. Perhaps they wanted this, and then they should have put curly brackets in. And this will now, I hope, work properly. So if I run this, it now says x is less than 10. So if you have one of these vague situations referred to as the dangling else, it's best to put in curly brackets. Otherwise, the else goes with the if that's closest to it. All right. Hopefully this all makes sense. You've used if-else statements many times. So thanks so much for watching, and get to work.